Welcome back to Winning Isn't Easy. Cigna's improper use of disability guidelines in denying a claim. I'm going to bring this analysis to you so you can see what disability carriers do and how they improperly use these guidelines in denying a claim or terminating benefits. Now, disability guidelines can't be blindly accepted or considered to be sacred. If that was the case, there would cease to be guidelines and there would be standards or mandates. Guidelines are just that. They're guidelines, and they have to be based on appropriate data and research. They should reflect outcomes and should be constantly monitored, evaluated, and updated. The purpose of guidelines is to serve as guides in promoting the education of healthcare providers and in applying guidelines to determining entitlement to benefits. Really is not necessarily the purpose of guidelines. It's really, guidelines are designed primarily for the well-being of the patient. But of course, disability carriers or plans use them for nefarious purposes in creating reasons to deny or terminate benefits. So let me give you an example. I'm going to tell you the story of Ms. Monroe, who suffered from a number of medical conditions. Now, one of the things that we see in guidelines is that guidelines don't encompass every diagnosis or the treatment of all diseases, and they don't really consider variations because each one of us are individuals. And in this instance, the court ultimately found that Ms. Monroe's medical conditions had to be considered individually and in conjunction with each other. Again, the purpose of these guidelines is really to be a benefit for the patient, not to be used as a weapon in a disability insurance claim. But organizations and carriers like Cigna use these guidelines as a tripwire to trigger increased efforts or other activities such as claim denials. In other words, they may say, look, based on the guidelines, this person should be able to go back to work at this point. We're going to contact, and that trips our tripwire, and they send you an activity of daily living form, or they contact your physician, or they put surveillance on you, or they call you. And so these increased efforts are really in an effort to create a reason to deny or terminate your benefits. Now, one of the disability guidelines that is used is something called WIE. And this WIE is an industry-wide standard who basically will reward case managers who take risks in lowering the disability duration claims in guidelines. And ultimately, they use these as a way to establish goals for denial and termination and to create ways to recognize and reward this kind of behavior. And in fact, the president of WIE in 2005 really admitted to that being the purpose of that particular guideline. Well, why is that? Because it's cost savings. It's cost savings because there are ways that they're going to terminate benefits that will save them money. And this use of duration guidelines is just one of them. Now, there are complications resulting from the use of disability guidelines. Guidelines are based on, like, this is the actual date of the event, and this is X number of days after that they should be recovered and able to go back to work. And what we find is that there's a mismatch in the disability durations based on the nature of the person's recovery, their response to treatment, their functional abilities, and the demands of their own occupation or any occupation. And obviously, these guidelines do not consider variations in injured or disabled people based on the same kind of circumstances. In other words, I may react differently to a total knee replacement than somebody else, and my recovery period may be quicker, or I may have complications that prevent me from going back to work. The guidelines do not, in my view, adequately address complications. They basically are using hard numbers. If you had surgery on this date, you should be recovered by this date, you should be able to go back to work. So the disability duration guidelines are not, I think, appropriate. And there are disability duration guidelines that are used in workers' comp, in personal injury cases, But one of the favorite ones that's used in ERISA litigation is the Medical Disability Advisor by the WIE Group. Now, the WIE Group, by the way, is also a servicing company for disability carriers and work closely with employers in return to work issues. And I want to quote for you part of the introduction. And this is the Medical Disability Advisor, 5th edition, 2005 by WIE Group in its introduction, page 12 to 14. And it says that disability is a relational concept and it doesn't equal functional impairment. Though many times disability carriers will stop the payment of benefits because they'll say the person isn't functionally impaired. Now, WIE Group, who, as I said, services disability policies and plans, also misapplies the concept of functional impairment, even though their own guideline says something different. So the introduction notes that the vast majority of people with disability have minimal objective findings on careful medical evaluation. That's bull. And the introduction continues to say, pain is the most common disabling condition, which is impossible for another person to observe or measure directly. Managing medical disability by utilizing disability duration guidelines is admittedly an imperfect approach. And if it's imperfect, then why on earth are you using it? That's my response. These guidelines are not intended to be used as a device to coerce workers back to work when they're unable to perform their normal duties. Well, of course, that's bull too, because they use disability duration guidelines all the time, and they get you to try to admit that you can go back to work or get your physician to admit that you can go back to work, even though you still may be recovering. The introduction goes on to say the use of a tool has to be, this tool, disability duration guidelines, has to be done with prudence, compassion, and thoughtfulness. And in doing so, treat everyone the way you and yourself would like to be treated. Now, this is the golden rule that we were raised by, but I assure you that it doesn't work that way. So I started out by saying I was going to tell you the story of Ms. Monroe. And this is the case of Warbaugh versus Continental. And the court ruled that the disability duration guidelines used by Continental had qualifications in it that invalidated the whole use of the guidelines. And in this particular case, Reliance, who was the administrator, failed to supply the guidelines to her in the appeal process. And the court said, look, this deprives her of a full and fair review, and the guidelines are just guidelines. They fail to take into account her individual presentation and her multiple medical conditions. And the court said, look, the use of guidelines in a case like this is just de novo wrong. It's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. So you can see that disability carriers and plans will use comorbid disability guidelines, return to work guidelines, not in the spirit in which the WIE Group suggested. They do use these guidelines to coerce disabled policyholders to give up their disability claim and try to convince them that they really have to return to work when in fact they are still entitled to their disability benefits. I hope that you have learned a lot in this episode of Winning Isn't Easy. If this game is being played in your case, you're only going to have 180 days in which to file an appeal. And the appeal is the trial of your case. If you are not represented, you need to get an attorney right away so that they can get a copy of the claims file and find out what disability duration guidelines or comorbid disability guidelines were used to improperly deny or terminate your benefits. Got it? If you've enjoyed this episode, please like our page, leave a review, share it with your family or friends, and please subscribe to our podcast. That way you're going to get notification of when a next episode drops. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, as I said, and I look forward to speaking with you in our next episode